I am an orthopedic trauma surgeon, which means I specialize in making order out of chaos. Show me someone whose body is shattered, and I will remain calm. My training gives me the confidence in myself as a surgeon and a leader in my surgical team. But it's not this confidence that makes me successful as a surgeon or a leader. What I've discovered gives you great success as a surgeon is trust. But building trust amongst trauma is very unique. Between the leader and the person being led, you have two people having vastly different experiences. One is in control, the other feels helpless. One's been in a situation many times before. For the other, it's a first. One is thinking about strategy and minimizing risk. The other is thinking life may never be the same again. When you think about trust, you think about mutuality. It is impossible to build trust on just one side. Each party has to take a risk, do their fair share, and meet the other person halfway. But meeting someone halfway when they're undergoing trauma is not realistic. So how can you do this? Well, one model you may have seen in the past, maybe perhaps from your doctor, is assertiveness. In this style, the doctor comes in with the "I've got this" attitude and gets to work. But in this situation, you're not a partner. In fact, you're often an obstacle. Now, I suspect many of you have probably experienced this, whether it's from a doctor, a politician, an employer. Your interests are always secondary to the task at hand. And I don't care who you are and who they are, it really never feels good to feel like you're in the way. Now, in March of 2020, I happened to be chair of the Nashville Board of Health. And let's be honest, who the heck knew Nashville had a Board of Health in 2020, and much less who the chair was. But I was that guy. And by virtue of faith and circumstance, I ended up being asked to chair the COVID-19 Taskforce for the city of Nashville. The city that became my home in 1984 after my family and me left a war-torn country. I was 6 years old, and this community took us in, and the health department took care of me and my brother. And now I was being asked to do my part. I went from the operating room to the press room, answering questions from politicians, journalists, and residents. All of them my neighbor, and all of them undergoing trauma in their own way. Now look, I'm definitely not a politician. I'm far from being a public relations expert. But I realized pretty quickly that we were all undergoing crisis. And the first thing that we needed to do if we were going to lead people through this crisis was to build trust. Now, I've done an ungodly amount of amputations in my career. Do you know what the first thing I often say when I come up to the patient's bedside right before surgery? What are we doing today? Could you imagine? That's pretty stupid, right? You're laying there knowing that your life's about to change, that you're about to lose an extremity, and I, as your surgeon, come in and ask you what I'm supposed to be doing. Now, in the late 1990s, orthopedic surgeons started an initiative called Sign Your Sight, which mandates that surgeons go up to the bedside and literally write their initials on the extremity that you're operating on. Now, surgeons are tired, and we go from patient to patient, and sometimes mistakes happen. Sometimes you do cut the left leg instead of the right. But I have discovered that this simple question is more than just a safety check. It's also a great way for me to develop a partnership with my patient. And it's a partnership dependent on trust. And that's what I hope to talk to you about today. Now, my first real public role with the pandemic came in the second press conference of the pandemic held by city leaders and packed with media. The energy in the room was so intense. Almost right off the bat, this journalist threw a question at city leaders, accusing us of a big screw up and a lie and being part of a cover-up. Well, one of my colleagues decided to approach the podium, and he looked at this reporter and he said, kind of, by the way, like I do to my kids when they throw tantrums, "I hear you, and I appreciate your feelings." It's not feelings, it's fact, this reporter shouted out. The press conference was evolving to chaos so quickly. And I was standing in the back, and sometimes wish I was even further back, listening to this reporter's every word, hanging on to everything he was saying. And I realized that he was speaking on behalf of hundreds, if not thousands, of Nashvillians. All of them my neighbors, and all of them undergoing crisis and trauma in their own ways. So for whatever reason, I walked up to the podium and tapped my colleague on the shoulder, and it was tough, right? I tapped him, and I'm like, all right, let me try this. And I approached the podium like I approached a patient's bedside. I looked at this reporter, whose question, by the way, was how many tests the city has and how we plan to deploy them. I said, you know, man, I don't know. Immediately, the atmosphere in the room changed. And I think that was because it became very quickly evident that I wasn't trying to push some agenda or push some talking points. I literally was listening to the patient, who happened to be the journalist, and responding and gave him the answer that everyone in the room knows, that we really didn't know all the answers at this point. Now, after that experience, we went on, and I decided that, how are we going to develop trust in this quick trauma crisis? And I realized the way to build trust really involves 3 steps in crisis. One is you listen, as I did with that reporter. Instead of going into a patient's room and telling them what I think they want to hear, I listen. I give them an opportunity to speak. Second, I slow things down. Now, this is one of the primary characteristics of sign your sight. Instead of, trauma situations are very time sensitive, but you need to be efficient, not hurried. Mistakes happen when you're hurried. People get hurt when you're hurried. And third, you have to respect the other individual. By acknowledging to my patient this question and asking them to give me an answer, I'm acknowledging that their opinion matters, and they are just more than some helpless body I'm about to cut. Now, after that first press conference where we listened to this reporter and heard what he was saying, we decided we need to do more. And so I ended up, having a situation in which we needed to slow things down. Now, as I mentioned, the primary characteristic of trauma is chaos. And one of the best ways to bring order to chaos is to slow things down. And that develops trust. Now, I have had patients who have had some horrible experiences where they will be in a bad car wreck, and then they'll get flown into the hospital on life flight. And when they come to the emergency room, they go to a trauma center, and this trauma center has like 20 people poking and prodding at them. It's just extremely chaotic. And then quickly they get brought upstairs to the operating room, where often is where I meet them right before we roll back to surgery. When I meet up with the patient for the very first time, right before surgery, I just halt all activities. This patient's been through so much chaos in the first few minutes that they were there. I stop all IVs from going in. I stop any blood being drawn. And I just sit there with my patient. And I answer any questions they may have. I ensure them that I'm going to be there with them throughout the entire surgery and through their recovery. Now, I may have lost my patients a few minutes of valuable time, but in doing so, I gave them the room to trust us. Now, after that first press conference, after I answered the reporter's questions about uncertainty around tests, I gave a more nuanced answer because I realized that the tension in the room wasn't necessarily about the trauma. The tension in the room is about whether or not to choose to trust us. So my nuanced answer really came down to, explaining to the patient that we had just learned about labs that were coming online, and we didn't know which labs were able to fully distribute all the tests. And so we needed to know before we let the public know with certainty. I created the room for that reporter and others in the rooms to choose to trust us. And in doing so, and giving precedence over his words over the task, I realized that we were doing the same thing, informing and calming. As a trauma surgeon, it's so tempting when I see a patient in the operating room area to just tell them whatever they want to hear, right? Their leg's crushed, they've been through so much, and they're like, hey doc, you think next week I can run that marathon I've been training for? I mean, their leg's literally dangling by tissue. And I want to say, yeah, why not? Right? Helps going on, but people aren't dumb. They want to know how bad the situation is, what you're going to do about it, and what the likelihood is of success. So while making comments like anything is possible, and you may, or let's see, sound like a great way to get the patient to surgery, I lose an ability by saying that of showing myself as trustworthy. So I say no. I've had to say that many times before, and I know it's hard to hear, but I also know, because my patients have told me, that when I tell them, it shows them that I respect them, and that what they really felt in their gut was probably the truth, was in fact the truth. After that press conference and the many other media appearances I had so many people come up to me in the street, and it's always very humbling to hear this. They always say I gave them a sense of calm. And I would ask them why. And what they would tell me almost inevitably was, I gave them a sense of calm not because I was sugarcoating information or trying to hold something from them. In fact, it's the exact opposite. They could tell that I respected their ability to understand the facts and to process them and do what they need to do with it. Okay, so at this point, you guys are saying, all right, I'm all for good bedside manner and all, but results are a little bit more important, don't you think? Well, I agree with you to an extent. But after the trauma and after the surgery is the aftermath. And sometimes aftermaths are complicated. Sometimes healing takes longer than you expected. Sometimes additional surgeries are required. Now, how do you define success in a pandemic response? Well, as a city, we had one of the highest vaccination rates in the state, consistent with the national average. We lost fewer lives than models predicted those early days. And our mass vaccination and testing sites were held up as examples to follow around the country. But lives were changed, disrupted, and lost. We are still in the aftermath of a trauma response. A leader in a crisis who relies on results alone to justify the manner in which they led are doing nothing more than wagering their relationship with the patient. Because sometimes results are hard to define. Sometimes you have partial victories or failures. Now, it has been shown that a relationship that a patient and their surgeon have before surgery impacts patient satisfaction, patient outcomes, and patient behaviors, and impacts the incidence of malpractice suits. True. If your surgeon doesn't listen to you, doesn't make space for you, doesn't respect you, and the surgery's a failure, there's nothing left. No results, no trust. You're back to where you started. Brokenness, chaos. But if your surgeon or leader builds a relationship based on trust, then there's hope that even in a failure or partial victory, there'll be hope that you can recover together. Now, I know that many people in this room probably won't be cutting any legs anytime soon. And I hope to God none of us ever have to respond to a pandemic like we just had. But all of you are leaders, and all of you will be asked to lead in a moment of crisis, whether it's at your home, your place of work, or your community. So when you're asked to stand at that podium, sign your site. Invite them to be your partner. Listen to them, slow things down, and respect them. Thank you so much.